This is a Town Roots Podcast, episode number 36.
Welcome to the Town Roots Podcast, the podcast of, about, and for Oakland. No matter if you live in the town, do business here, or are visiting, we have something for you. And now, your hosts, Anthony Wilson and Vincent Hayes.
Today we have Liam ODonoghue from the East Bay Yesterday podcast. Hey, Liam, how are you?
I'm doing pretty great. Anthony, Vincent, thanks for having me on today.
Glad to have you.
Yeah. So I know that East Bay Yesterday is not just a podcast, but I know it is a great podcast. But why don't we just start with that, sort of how to get started and what are you up to?
Yeah, it started as a podcast about 6 years ago. And since then, it has grown into a lot of things that I wasn't expecting when I launched this project. It got picked up by KPFA, so it's now on the radio. And I do all kinds of events, walking tours, things at different theaters, bookstores, museums, etc. I've done a map of Oakland. I've done some T-shirts. And probably one of the things I'm most proud of is that it's actually being used in a lot of curriculums now by local teachers everywhere from the middle school level up through the grad school level. People who are looking for ways to get their students excited about local history are using the podcast and the radio show to get the kids excited about that. So that's been really rewarding to see that happen. But it started, like I said, all about 6 years ago. And there's a bunch of reasons I can get into if you want me to go deep, but really the kind of in a nutshell is just because every time I talk to people who lived around Oakland or lived around the East Bay for a long time, I realized they had really good stories and stories that I hadn't known about before they told me. And I felt like stories that most people probably weren't aware of. And I felt like someone needed to collect those stories and share them and celebrate them. There's a lot of different museums and films and things like that about San Francisco history, not so much about Oakland. Yeah.
That's cool. Let's definitely go deeper on that. So you're talking to people and they're telling you stories, and I'm guessing you're thinking, oh, these are cool, but what gave you the inspiration to turn that into a podcast?
Yeah, so my background is journalism. I started actually interviewing people when I was about 15 years old. I don't know if some of your listeners are going to remember this, but there was in the 90s, there were these things called zines that people would do. This was before the era of Facebook and social media and everything. So it was really unusual for people outside of the sort of mainstream media, TV and magazines and newspapers to self-publish. But I started self-publishing when I was a kid, basically talking to local musicians around Chicago. And that got me interested in journalism. That grew throughout my career. And then I actually had gotten laid off from my last full-time journalism job in about 2016, I believe. And so I was trying to figure out what my next pivot would be, what I wanted to focus on. And I wanted something that would have lasting value, something that was locally oriented, because I really enjoy doing stories about people that I can actually go meet in person and not just talk to on the phone. And the other thing that was really happening at that time that I'm sure you'll remember, and something that's still happening and has been happening for a long time, but I felt like it was particularly noticeable sort of during the mid-20 teens, is a lot of displacement and gentrification happening in Oakland. I knew a lot of people who had been living in the East Bay for a long time who couldn't afford to live here anymore, people getting evicted, a lot of friends who just decided to pack up and leave because their rent was basically eating up their whole paycheck. And so seeing that transition, I wanted to make sure that the older generations or people who had been here for a long time, that their legacies were recorded essentially before they packed up and left. And then also I wanted to make these stories accessible to all the new people moving here so that new people coming to Oakland wouldn't just think, hey, this is a blank slate for me to turn into my little techie playground or whatever. I welcome people who want to move to Oakland. I think it's a great city. It's good to see people wanting to come here, but people need to recognize that there's a lot of families and communities that have been here for generations, and we can't forget about those. We got to respect the history. There's like that a couple different missions that I was going towards with the podcast, and also I just thought it was really interesting. Oakland and the East Bay has such a fascinating history: music, food, culture, politics, etc. I try to cover it all. So yeah, it's been a good run. I'm almost to 100 episodes now.
Wow, impressive! So it's East Bay yesterday and today. Right. So
absolutely.
Is it more yesterday?
That's the thing. I try to make it relevant. Yeah. History is a hook, but history can be things that happened 10 years ago. History can be the hyphy movement. History can be, I use that as the broad umbrella, but I try to make it relevant for things that are happening now in people's lives. Yeah.
And so what are some of the more interesting stories that have stood out to you over the 6 years?
Oh my gosh. It's hard to choose because there's been so many. There's one interview that always pops into my mind just because this woman made such an impression on me. There's a blues singer by the name of Sugar Pie DeSanto. And she used to perform in a lot of places, but specifically in West Oakland during the heyday of the blues scene on 7th Street. And I feel like, now a lot of people are starting to recognize that was a valuable time in Oakland's history. A lot of culture was created. It really kind of set the blueprint for a lot that happened afterwards. But most people just know it from old photos or reading about it. She lived it. And so hearing her tales of how wild things got and just how fun it was and just some of the crazy things that she told me really brought that era of West Oakland and that Black history to life for me. And also, she's in her 80s now, and this woman is still a firecracker. She showed up to my house dressed like Nicki Minaj. She was like full body, onesie, leopard print suit, like gold jewelry dangling, and she's a spicy lady for someone in her 80s, still a rock star as far as I'm concerned. And if you even look at videos of her from not that long ago, where she's like, even in her 70s, early 80s, she'll bring guys up on stage, jump on them and roll around. She's like an acrobat up there. So this is the one thing I remember from this interview is that she toured with James Brown. She used to play with James Brown a lot, and people even called her the Lady James Brown for a while because she was so energetic. And I'm not going to do the voice, but she has a great James Brown impression. And in James Brown's voice, she said he would tell her after shows, Sugar Pie, don't jump around so much on stage. You're making me work harder. You're making me look bad. I got to work twice as hard just to keep up with you. So this woman just had stories like that for days. So I love finding people like that just, and she lived a couple blocks away from my house. She lived right off Telegraph.
Yeah.
So just knowing that there's people like that with these stories who live in your neighborhood, it's been amazing to me because every episode I learned so much too. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I hope you got a picture of her showing up to your house. Do you have that?
No, I do. I don't always take photos with my guests, but with this one, I was like, yeah, I'm going to need to capture this moment for sure.
That's awesome. As you got your podcast started, what kind of stories did you start off with? And then did you move from where you started to something different? Where did the tales, or not tales, but stories that you were trying to share initially, and then where have you gone from there?
Absolutely. It's a really good question. It's all over the place because one of the things I knew that I wanted to do with the show is have a big variety. I feel like Oakland and the East Bay, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different immigrant groups. There's a lot of different kinds of food. There's a lot of different kinds of music. There's a lot of history. I wanted to touch on a little bit of all that. And for example, one of the most prominent elements of Oakland's history is, of course, like the Black Panthers. And their story's been told a lot. There's been documentaries and books and films about the Panthers. So I didn't just want to do the same story when I eventually, because I knew I'd have to talk about the Black Panthers. And of course I wanted to as well, but I didn't want to just repeat what's already been told. And at the time, when I attended the Black Panthers 50th anniversary reunion party, I got to talking with Erica Huggins. And she told me about the Black Panthers school. And I think that is one of the elements, for example, of the party that's less well known. So when I did my first episode about the Black Panthers, I focused on the school that was run by the women of the party, that a lot of people who live in Oakland now actually attended when they were kids. So I knew it would resonate with folks. And so that's one example. A lot of the time, it's just stories that would pop up on my radar that I wasn't planning on covering. There was this woman who I had heard about who had been running a soul food restaurant in West Oakland since the World War II era. Going back decades, she was in her 80s and she was retiring. And as soon as I heard she was retiring and shutting down the restaurant, I was like, I need to get over there. I need to talk to this lady. So sometimes it's just like I'll hear about something. Sometimes people have requests that I want to cover. Like people always ask, what's the story about Bruce Lee? Did he really live in Oakland? What people say that he had this legendary fight here. And sometimes I cover stories that people are demanding to get to the bottom of. So I did the Bruce Lee episode. That one was really popular. And then other times there's certain events in Oakland history that were, I think, very significant that I want to make sure they cover. So like the Oakland General Strike, for example, or World War II history, like the shipyards and things like that. But it's really all over the place. If someone has a good story idea or if someone introduces me to someone who's got good stories, I'll have them on the show. I try to not really get stuck in the same rut of like just politics or just food or just music. I try to really jump all over the place and cover a lot of different bases. I've even done a couple sports episodes because, of course, West Oakland's just got an incredible sports history with all the all-stars and superstars that have come out of McClymonds High School, for example.
That's awesome. That's awesome. One quick question, more for me than probably our listeners. What about Esther's orbit room? Have you ever done anything that covers that?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So Esther's has been mentioned in a couple episodes. This is funny because I haven't thought of this in a long time, but a couple years ago, I interviewed a guy who was a mailman at the post office across the street from Esther's. And he told me that he was coming out of work one day and he was on the night shift. So he was coming out like it was probably 6 a.m. or something like that. And he said all the postal workers were leaving at the same time. So there's like dozens or hundreds of people leaving the building. So it was shift change. At that time, a gunfight broke out in Esther's parking lot. So all these postal workers are like running, ducking, diving behind mailboxes while people are shooting it out in Esther's parking lot. But I haven't done a full episode just about Esther's yet. However, I know that there's a local economic development group that I think is working on getting the property and revitalizing and bringing it back to life. So hopefully when Esther's is about to have their grand reopening, that would be a really good news hook to look deep into the history and cover what's happened there over the years. And I think there's even some archival videotapes or audio tapes of Esther's giving interviews. Because I know she passed away a little while ago, Esther Marbury, but I would love to include her voice in the story as well, since it's her name on the sign. Yeah. Oh, one other good story is I talked to someone who used to hang out at Esther's, and they told me they went there once I think it was like the late 90s. And they said that they sat down at Esther's and they looked over and Jerry Brown was sitting at one table and Mac Dre was sitting at another table, like 2 tables down. So imagine just walking to a bar and seeing Jerry Brown sitting like 10 feet away from Mac Dre. Sounds like it was quite an interesting place. Yeah.
No kidding. Good. That's awesome. As you've gotten to this moving and growing, what's been kind of like your proudest moment about what the podcast has been able to do in terms of sharing information about it?
It's always changing because I'm always getting feedback that makes me feel good about what I'm doing. Like everyone who does these kind of self-produced type shows, I have ups and downs. There's days when I'm thinking, no, what am I doing? Not enough people are listening. Are people going to like this? Is it going to resonate with folks? And then once in a while, I'll put out an episode or I'll put out a story, and the responses I get will literally bring tears to my eyes. And what I'm thinking about is just, for example, yesterday, actually 2 days ago. So since I started doing the podcast, the local media organization SF Gate has asked me to do a monthly column about Oakland. And so I just put out a story this weekend about this woman who her dad was a photographer in Oakland in the 70s. He owned a little photo shop on 17th and Webster. And her father died about 20 years ago. And when he died, he left her his whole collection of photographs. And last year or 2 years ago, when she got pregnant, she moved all the photos from her apartment down into the storage unit to make room for her baby that was on the way. And her storage unit got broken into. And all the photos got stolen. And that was her whole dad's life work. All his photos, basically her last connection to him, her last physical connection to him. And she was devastated. And this random guy found the photos on the street. Like whoever robbed her storage unit dumped the photos, was able, after weeks of trying, to track her down and figure out who they belonged to and return the photos. And so I wrote an article about that for the newspaper. And they published some of his photos and the story. And in response to that article, I heard from dozens of people with all kinds of stories, ranging from folks who recognize some of the people who were like on the street in Oakland in the 70s in some of these pictures, to people who, were sharing stories to me like, hey, this really touched me because I lost my house in a fire, or I lost my possessions, or my things were stolen. I lost all my family photos. And just to see this woman being reconnected with her family history and how much joy it brought her made me feel a little bit better and put a smile on my face. Anytime I can put out a story like that I feel like has an emotional impact on people, makes people feel good, or makes people kind of want to reflect on their own lives and what it means to be like a member of a community. Like this guy who found the photos, he could have just walked by him. He didn't have to spend all this time trying to track her down. And most of us, if we see a pile of stuff on the street, we probably just assume it's garbage and just keep walking. But he took the time and tracked her down. And so I just think that's a cool lesson too. Like you never know what you're going to just stumble across when you're just going about your business, walking on the sidewalk.
What's the story behind tracking her down? How did he find her?
So most of the photos were not identified. Like there wasn't notes or writing on most of them, but he looked through hundreds of photos and he found the name Raymond Cooper written on a couple of them. And so that was her dad's name. And on a baby picture, he found the name Asia, AJA. So he thought maybe her name was Asia Cooper. And he searched her out on Facebook and Instagram. And at first he wasn't getting a response. I think, you know how like when you try to message someone who you're not friends with, sometimes it goes to spam folder, like a junk folder. So I think she like didn't see the messages at first. And then eventually she found that he had messaged her on her Instagram account, and they were able to connect, and they lived just a couple blocks away from each other. Yeah.
So Liam, I imagine a lot of these people that you come across have not told these stories publicly, right? They've told them to friends and family. And so you approach them with the prospect of telling them publicly. How does that go over? Are they excited about that, or are they hesitant about it?
So there's something that happens to me a lot when I'm talking to someone or planning to interview someone who's never really been interviewed before, or most of the people I interview are not famous. They're not used to sitting down with someone who's going to put a microphone in their face. And especially with the older folks, I do talk to a lot of people in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. I think the oldest person I've ever interviewed was the park ranger, Betty Reed Soskin, who I believe is over 100 years old now.
Yeah.
I think I talked to her when she was about 98 or 99.
She just recently retired, right?
Yeah, she finally, she hung it up. But she's so motivated. I don't know if she's ever really going to retire. I think she's still giving talks once in a while. But so a lot of the time when I talk to these old folks, I'll sit down and I'll tell them what I'm interested in talking about. And a lot of them, they'll be so humble. They'll say, oh, my story's not that important. I don't know why you want to talk to me. I don't even know if I really remember anything. And sometimes I'll ask them to like bring out a photo album. I'm like, well, let's look at some pictures. Maybe looking at some old photos will jog your memory, or maybe just describe what we're looking at to get the ball rolling. And they'll be like, okay, I've got 15 minutes or I've got a half hour, a busy day. I'll tell you a couple things. And then as soon as those floodgates open, it's like, boom, the stories just start pouring out. And I'll sit down with people who said they had 20 minutes to talk, and we'll talk for 3-4 hours. Wow. Sometimes, and they'll just keep going. I'm the one who's like, I got to make dinner. And then when I send them, the show, when it comes out, because it usually takes me after the interview a couple of weeks to put everything together, I'll send it to them, and they'll send it around to their families, and they'll be like, oh, I never even told my grandkids this story. And thank you. And the thing that really is touching to me is a few people that I've interviewed since I started doing the show have passed away since then. And so I caught them at the end of their life when they were reflecting on their youth or something important that happened to them and raising family and things like that. And I've heard from different families after, like, I'll put out an episode and I'll connect with them, and then a year or two will pass, and then someone will follow up with me and say, hey, I just want to let you know my mom died or my grandma died. And, thanks for recording that, because now we have something to remember her by. That just makes me feel like whenever I have doubts about what I'm doing, that makes me feel like, okay, even if the show isn't making a bunch of money or like on a big network or whatever, it's not getting bought by Spotify for $1 million or whatever. Like, at least there's value. This family, or like these people that I care about who live around here, and I'll bump into people sometimes. I'm out a lot. Like, I'm a pretty social guy, going out, walking the streets, riding my bike, going to restaurants, going to see music, going to the museum or whatever. And I'll bump into people who I know from the show. And I just love like that I'm always like reconnecting and getting updates on people's stories too. It just makes me feel I could never get tired of this. It makes me feel like I want to keep doing it forever. Yeah.
Well, there's still time for that Spotify.
Yeah.
And I'll also say the fact that SF Gay came to you to write an article must be pretty rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a young journalist, one of the most frustrating things was trying to pitch as a freelancer and tracking down editors and writing up these story ideas and then either not getting a response or getting rejected, or even worse, when you put a lot of time and effort into the article and it does run, and then you got to chase them down for the money that they owe you. Because that was an experience I had a lot as a young journalist as well. Hey, I know $300 doesn't sound like very much, but I got to pay my rent this month. And so, yeah, now just having where people are knocking on my door a lot and I don't have to work as hard to chase that money. Makes things a little bit nicer. And getting to choose the stories I want to tell too. Yeah, I feel like that's the other thing. Now they've got this track record of doing East Bay Yesterday. A lot of the editors I've worked with over the years at different publications and different podcasts, they have a little bit more trust in my ability to pick out good stories and kind of shape the stories the way that I want them to be told. Yeah. But you know what? One thing I should mention real quick is why I chose to do a podcast instead of writing, because my background is more print journalism, text journalism, and I'd never done audio before the show. And my thinking was that because the show is really about the people who I'm interviewing. It's not really about me. Like, I'm not telling the Liam ODonoghue story. I'm telling the Sugar Pie DeSanto story or whoever's story. I wanted their voices to really be the main thing driving the narrative. And when you write an article for a newspaper, maybe you have a couple quotes in from the person the story is about, but mostly it's the writer shaping the story their way. And with the podcast, I feel like I'm asking questions, but really it's the people I interview whose voices are carrying the show and they're telling the story in their own words the way they want it to be told. So I felt like that was really important.
So I would say that many people that are longtime and sort of natives of Oakland notice the change that's happening in the city. How do you feel about the way that the landscape of Oakland is changing? Is it in your mind, is it for the better or is it worse? Like, how do you feel about it?
Absolutely. And I think like a lot of people, I have mixed feelings. In fact, so I was feeling very disoriented by all the changes around 2018. I feel like there was this huge building boom and I lived pretty close to downtown. I lived on Telegraph, just about 10 blocks north, 10, 15 blocks north of downtown. And I was always walking and riding around there. And it felt every single time I went out, a building was getting knocked down and a new building was getting put up, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We need housing, and some of the buildings that were getting knocked down were just like parking garages or buildings that probably had asbestos and lead paint and stuff like that. So like we need to make sure that there's some development as long as it's responsible and not just luxury development. But basically, to get to the point, one of the ways I wanted to understand that change, that what I felt was a rapid change that was happening in Oakland, was by looking at other past eras when there's been a lot of rapid change. And I was looking at after the railroads came here in the 1870s, during the gold rush, during the Great Depression, during World War II, during like the 60s and 70s. And there's been all these times throughout Oakland history where things really change very fast, massive development, all kinds of new things happening. And so that made me realize that like change is basically constant. Like cities are always changing, always evolving. Really, nothing ever stays the same. So it's like, how do we approach that change? How do we try to push it in the right direction? And so I think in terms of the negative parts of what you're talking about, Oakland becoming more unaffordable for people. I remember 20 years ago, young people who wanted to come to Oakland, they could get a room for a couple $100 a month. You could like easily plug in. But now, poof, I have good luck finding a place under $1,000, $2,000, whatever. It's always fluctuating. And it seems like a lot of the accessibility of Oakland is disappearing. And I am worried that it'll become eventually more like San Francisco, which is an elite city now. It's just, I think, hard for anyone who's not making tech money to move to San Francisco and live in a sort of desirable building or a nice area, unless you're like just piling in 4 people to a room or whatever. And I've done that before too. When I first moved to San Francisco, I lived with 15 different people. And that was kind of fun when you're like 22, 23, whatever. But if you want to raise a family or if you want a little more privacy or something like that, it's not so great. I feel like as long as there's efforts by like our city leaders and people in positions of power to make sure that there's going to be affordable housing and solutions to keep longtime residents from being displaced, I think it's okay for Oakland to grow. But if the growth is just about pushing people out who have been here for a long time or people that can't afford to pay $2,000 or $3,000 a month for rent, then that's a big problem. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
I totally agree with you there. I feel like as things change in some ways for the better, because some of the buildings that we have here in Oakland do need a facelift or actually could be repurposed. I think we also need to be mindful of like how much that changes the city and the culture and all that. But I think in some ways it is necessary, a necessary evil, if you will. But let's shift again, if you don't mind, a very ugly word. So as you think about that experience for you and your podcast and some of the stories that you try and convey through that medium, like how did that make you feel? How did that change the way you delivered your content in terms of the stories you told? Like, did that do anything for you or is it just status quo for you?
No, it changed a lot, actually. So eventually, after people started, you'll probably remember at the beginning, it was like lockdown. Like people weren't really going out. People weren't really leaving the house. And then eventually people started going out more, but they would just hang out like outside. So I started doing a lot of interviews in like public parks or in people's backyards. So there's this whole era of East Bay yesterday in like 2021, for example, before the vaccines came out, when you can always hear like birds in the background and like people playing basketball and like traffic and stuff like that. Because I was doing a lot of interviews out at picnic tables and things like that. But at the very beginning, when it was like full on lockdown, I was trying to figure out what to do because people weren't even really meeting up at all back then. And I didn't just want to do phone interviews. I feel like, I don't know, I'm not crazy about it. I really like to have that personal sort of face-to-face interaction with people when I'm interviewing them. And so I was trying to think about how I could use archival archival audio to create episodes out of interviews that maybe have already existed that I could repurpose. And I remembered this is like an intense story, but I remember that a couple years ago, right before she passed away, I'd interviewed my grandma. And I had, like most people, I had 4 grandparents at one point, and they all had passed away except for her. So she was the last living grandparent I had. And I never interviewed any of the other ones because I just wasn't doing audio interviews when they were alive. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I've got one grandma left. I got to sit down and ask her about her life story. So I interviewed her for a couple of hours. And we spent a lot of time talking about her years in the Bay Area because in the late 60s, early 70s, my grandpa was stationed at the Oakland Army base. And my grandma was really involved in like volunteering for a lot of stuff there, and the wives clubs and things like that. And so I did this whole interview with my grandma about her experiences in the East Bay. And she ended up being like a big quilter. And the way that she got inspired to start making quilts was by a show that she saw at the Oakland Museum in like 1971. And so I ended up and when I interviewed her, I was never thinking about using it for the podcast. I was like, oh, this is just for my own personal family use. But then I was like, you know what, maybe I could turn this into an episode since we're all in the pandemic mode right now. And we're thinking about our families and the people we're closest to and loss and death and everything like that. And so I made that one into an episode, and I probably wouldn't have done it if I wasn't in lockdown. Honestly, I feel like the lockdown sort of made me pivot and think about some different kind of creative ways to approach the format and get a little more experimental. Yeah. But I'm glad the pandemic's over or winding down. That's for sure. I definitely like to meet people in person and do an interview over like a beer or a cup of coffee or something like that, face to face.
Yeah, no, this has definitely been an interesting couple of years. I'm glad that you were able to kind of keep things alive. I think there are a number of businesses and just changes in people's lives that have dramatically affected the landscape of Oakland. So I'm glad to see that you were able to pivot and weather the storm, and you're still here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
William, one thing that you told us about, and this is completely different from other things that we talked about here.
Yeah.
You mentioned to us that you never expected to be doing boat tours. What's up with that?
Yeah, the podcast is the main anchor of East Bay Yesterday. It's what I love to do. I love interviewing people. I love telling the stories. But it's grown into all these different sort of side projects and side hustles too. So one of my main income sources these days is being a tour guide, something I wasn't expecting when I started the show. This was not my master plan. But a couple of years ago, a friend of mine was actually a friend of a friend was working for this company called Fish Emeryville, and they take people out on sport fishing tours. So depending on what season it is, they're taking people out to catch salmon, halibut, crab, you name it. Crab season's coming up pretty soon. I'm pretty pumped about that because my Christmas bonus is usually a couple Dungeness crabs fresh off the boat. But yeah, so I met up with these guys who run this fishing company, and they usually do these fishing tours in the morning, first thing in the morning. They're fishing, they're out there early, and they just have these boats sitting around in the afternoons and in the early evenings. And they're like, hey, do you want to come up with a history tour, take people around the bay? And the boat's got room for about 30 people and just see how it goes. And I was like, never thought of it before, but let's give it a shot. And I fell in love with it instantly. I love being out on the bay. I love being out on the water. And I love connecting with people too. I collect, people tell me their stories. I've gotten so many good story ideas from people I've met on the boat tours. It makes me understand how people relate to the podcast. Young people, old people, newcomers, people who've been here forever. We get all different kinds of folks on the tours. And I've been doing it for about 4 years right now. And every single tour has sold out. And I don't even really do much advertising. I don't do any advertising. I put it on my Instagram and my newsletter, and that's about it. And it's all word of mouth. People come, and it's just a unique experience. So we go from the Emeryville Marina out to the Berkeley Pier, Treasure Island, Yerba Buena Island, up the Port of Oakland to about Brooklyn Basin, back out the Alameda side. And then after about a year or two of doing that, I added another tour. I take people up to the Richmond area as well now, and up along Albany, El Cerrito, Richmond Bridge, East Brother Island, along there for a different tour. And Might even add a couple more at some point too, because I'm having so much fun doing them.
So no advertising, things sell out?
Always. Yeah, and usually they sell out pretty fast too. People are always angrily emailing me like, why did your boat tour sell out so fast? I can never get tickets.
Are they mainly visitors? They're mainly tourists?
You know what? A lot of it is people who have family visiting. So people will be like, oh, my parents are coming in town. Or parents will be like, oh, my kids are coming in town. They want like a unique experience for the trip. Or a lot of the time it'll be like a birthday present or a Christmas present. So whole families will come out. Like often it'll be like 5, 6, 7 people in a group. And I also do like charter tours as well. So like the East Bay Regional Park District managers took a tour, all the people from the podcast 99% Invisible. And I'm working with some educators right now. I might start taking some school groups as well. Yeah, they're just keeping me busy, but I love it. I always tell people it's like the best job in the world. It's out on the bay, telling stories. It's fun.
Oh, that is great. I'm gonna have to take that tour.
Oh, gotta get you out there, Anthony, for sure.
All right. So let me ask you this. When you take people out on the tour, is there like one common piece of history that everybody is kind of unaware of, but very surprised to hear about that you share?
Yeah, actually. And I'll give you like a little spoiler on the tour because this usually does surprise people. So similar to the podcast, I try to cover a lot of different elements of history on the tour. So I talk about nature history, port history, World War II, development. I take it all the way back to the origin of Oakland as a city, the waterfront, coming of the railroad, all that stuff. But we've all driven over the Bay Bridge. If you live in the Bay, you've driven over the Bay Bridge like a million times, right? So when we're cruising underneath the Bay Bridge, I tell people to look up, and there's something underneath the Bay Bridge, hanging off the bottom of the bridge that most people don't know about. And that is this giant sort of bird cage. And it's the largest colony of cormorants in the bay. They basically built this sort of hanging bird cage, and I call it the most expensive bird nest in the bay because apparently it cost $10 million. And there's 700 cormorants living right underneath the Bay Bridge, and they are active. They are diving for fish and swimming and hanging out and frolicking. And it's cool because it's surprising and it's just very active. The birds are always all over the place. But it's a little dangerous, too, because I warn people when we're heading underneath the Bay Bridge, the way that I put it is those birds aren't wearing diapers. So you got to look out. So if you're looking up, you might want to keep your mouth closed.
Now, when they created the new East Bay span of the bridge, did they retain that bird?
That was the thing, yeah. When they were tearing down the old span, they had to coax the birds to move to the new one. So it took 3 years they put like bird calls up there, mirrors, all decoys, all kinds of tricks of the trade. They had to get some bird experts into, I think, essentially, cajole the birds into leaving their old nest to move to this new one. It apparently was not an easy task.
Hey, Liam, this is great. I could listen to your stories all day long. But why don't you tell the listeners, how can they find the East Bay Yesterday podcast?
Awesome. Thank you. So the website is just eastbayyesterday.com. That's got links to my social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. The best way to find out about tours and events is I've got a free newsletter that I send out about once a month. There's a link to that on the website as well. And it's available wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple, yada, 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 Stitcher, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And if you do use a podcast app that you can't find East Bay Yesterday on, please let me know so I can make sure that I get that taken care of, because I want to make sure that people can find me wherever is most convenient for them.
Awesome. Hey, Liam, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much.
Hey, it's my pleasure, guys. Thanks a ton for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Town Roots Podcast. For more information about the show, to leave comments and connect with the hosts, head over to www.townroots.com.